The night has fallen. Here, fear is real, and the inexplicable rules. I am Yoon-Jin Lee, your companion on this journey through the darkest mysteries. This channel does not bring ordinary stories. It brings echoes, scars, truths that no one dares to tell. If you feel chills when seeking answers, you are in the right place. Close the door. Turn off the lights. We are about to confront the unknown. Because here, fear is just the beginning. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to tell you about a case that has haunted me since I first encountered the documentation. It is a case that remains, even now, deeply troubling. Not because of a dramatic conclusion or shocking revelation, but because of what it suggests about the nature of concealment, about how predatory behavior can hide in plain sight, and about the gap between suspicion and proof. The case I am about to discuss involves a man named Brandon RYNER. I should warn you in advance. This story contains references to obsessive behavior, surveillance, missing persons, and psychological manipulation. The story is presented here as it has been documented, researched, and analyzed by investigators, journalists, and researchers who continue to examine this case today. What makes the RYNER case particularly unsettling is not merely the documented facts, but the questions that remain unanswered. Questions about how much of his activity went undetected. Questions about whether he acted alone. Questions about whether everything came to light, or whether significant portions of his history remain hidden from public knowledge. Let us begin in a place that seems unremarkable, a place that most people would drive through without giving it a second thought. Chapter 1. Millbrook, Colorado. Autumn, 1998. Millbrook, Colorado existed in the autumn of 1998 as a place of quiet contentment. Nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, approximately 45 minutes northwest of Denver, it was a town that represented a particular vision of American suburban life. Population approximately 6,800 residents, streets lined with oak trees, modest homes with carefully maintained lawns. The kind of place where violent crime was something that happened in other cities, in other states, in other people's communities. Not here, not in Millbrook. The town had one main commercial district with a grocery store, a pharmacy, a hardware store, and several small restaurants. There were 2 elementary schools, 1 middle school, and 1 high school. There was a police department with approximately 20 officers. There was a volunteer fire department. There was a library that hosted regular community events. On the surface, Millbrook was exactly what suburban America promised to be: safe, predictable, and stable. On Timber Ridge Road, in a modest 2-story house painted pale yellow with dark green shutters, lived a man named Brandon RYNER. He was 39 years old. He had lived in Millbrook with his wife, Susan, for approximately 6 years. Together, they had 2 children, Michael, who was 12, and Catherine, who was 9. Brandon worked as a mid-level operations manager at a distribution warehouse located in Boulder, approximately 30 minutes east of Millbrook. He had held this position for 4 years. His performance reviews were consistently adequate. He was neither particularly outstanding nor problematic. He was, in the language of personnel management, a satisfactory employee. From the outside, the RYNER household appeared unremarkable. Susan was known in the community as a genuinely friendly woman. She volunteered at the elementary school's reading program 2 afternoons per week. She hosted a book club in her living room on the first Wednesday of every month. She baked cookies for church fundraisers. She remembered names. She smiled when greeting neighbors. People in Millbrook liked Susan RYNER. Michael and Catherine attended the local schools. They participated in age-appropriate activities: soccer, piano lessons, scout programs. There were family photographs taken during holidays and special occasions. The RYNERs, from any conventional perspective, represented the definition of a normal American family in the late 1990s. But beginning in late September of 1998, something began to shift in the perception of one particular neighbor. Chapter 2. The Beginning of Observation. Patricia Hendricks lived 3 houses down from the RYNERs on Timber Ridge Road. She was 48 years old, a former accountant who had retired early to raise her grandchildren. Her husband, Robert, worked as an electrical contractor. Patricia had what she described in later interviews as a keen sense of observation. She noticed details. She paid attention to patterns. This attention would later prove significant. In late September of 1998, Patricia began to notice Brandon RYNER in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. It was not something she could initially articulate precisely. It was a feeling more than a fact, an intuition based on small observations. She noticed that Brandon was often in his front yard or driveway. This alone was not unusual. Many people spend time in their yards. But Patricia observed that Brandon seemed to be present at specific times, and that his presence seemed purposeful, rather than coincidental. When Patricia left her home in the morning, Brandon would be standing by his mailbox. When Patricia returned from grocery shopping, Brandon would be raking leaves in his front yard, despite the fact that the leaves appeared to have already been raked the day before. When Patricia's teenage nephew visited and played basketball in her driveway, Brandon raked leaves for over an hour, while occasionally glancing in the direction of the driveway. Most significantly, Patricia noticed that Brandon would watch, not a casual glance of neighborly interest, but a sustained, focused observation. She would catch him looking in the direction of her home. When their eyes would meet, he would not look away immediately, or with embarrassment. Instead, he would hold her gaze for a moment longer than felt natural, before turning his attention elsewhere. Patricia mentioned these observations to her husband, Robert, who initially dismissed them as coincidence, or perhaps paranoia. But as the weeks progressed into October, and as Patricia continued to document the pattern, Robert began to share her concerns. They discussed the possibility that Brandon was engaging in behavior that was, at minimum, unusual. Whether it was something that could be considered criminal, neither of them could say with certainty. By the third week of October, Patricia had begun to keep a private notebook, not with any intention of formal documentation, but as a way to organize her thoughts and observations. She wrote down dates and times. She noted Brandon's location and activities. She noted what Patricia's own activities were at those moments. She noted the direction of Brandon's gaze. She was, in effect, creating a mirror image of something she did not yet understand. October 19th. Brandon in driveway, 6:47 a.m., holding coffee cup, looking toward our mailbox area for approximately 3 minutes. I had just stepped outside to collect the newspaper. October 24th. Observed Brandon raking front yard again. Has raked same area past 4 days despite no new leaves. Continued raking for 52 minutes. Appeared to position himself to observe activity on this side of street. October 28th. Brandon standing at edge of driveway. Approximately 5:15 p.m. Looking directly at our house. When I looked up from gardening, maintained eye contact for what felt like extended period before turning away. November 2nd. Brandon emerged from garage carrying what appeared to be a mirror or reflective surface. Carried it toward basement. This is now third time I have seen him carrying similar items toward the house. These observations, accumulated over approximately 6 weeks, created a pattern that Patricia found increasingly disturbing. She was a rational woman. She did not believe in false alarms or overreactions, but every instinct she possessed was telling her that something was wrong, that Brandon RYNER was engaged in behavior that, while perhaps not technically criminal, was fundamentally inappropriate. On November 4th, Patricia made the decision to contact the local police department and file a report. Chapter 3. The first report officer, Michael Delacroix, had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 23 years. He was 51 years old, experienced, methodical, and possessed of the kind of judgment that comes from decades of law enforcement work. He was working the afternoon shift on November 4th when Patricia Hendricks came into the station and requested to speak with someone about a concern regarding a neighbor. Officer Delacroix listened to Patricia's account carefully. She presented her observations in a clear, organized manner. She showed him her notebook. She explained that she had no concrete evidence of any criminal activity, but that she felt obligated to report behavior that seemed indicative of something concerning. Officer Delacroix asked Patricia a series of questions, the kinds of questions that are standard in such situations. Had Brandon approached her in a threatening manner? No. Had he made any verbal statements that could be construed as threatening? No. Had he trespassed on her property? No. Had she observed any specific criminal act? No. Not specifically. At the conclusion of the interview, Officer Delacroix made notations in an incident report. He explained to Patricia that without a specific criminal act or a clear threat, there were limitations on what official action could be taken. However, he noted, the department could increase patrols on Timber Ridge Road. If more specific incidents occurred, Patricia should contact the police immediately. Patricia thanked Officer Delacroix, though she did not feel entirely satisfied. She had expected, perhaps, that her observations would trigger immediate concern or investigation. Instead, She felt that she had been, if not dismissed, then certainly deprioritized. What Patricia Hendricks did not know was that Officer Delacroix took her report seriously, not immediately, and not in an active investigatory sense. But he filed the report, and he made a mental note. In his 23 years of law enforcement, he had learned to recognize certain patterns of communication. Women who came into police stations to report vague concerns about neighbors usually had reasons for doing so. Their instincts were often sound. He decided that he would, when he had opportunity, drive by Timber Ridge Road occasionally and observe conditions in the neighborhood. What Patricia also did not know was that Brandon RYNER had been aware of her observations for weeks. He had noticed her noticing him. He had understood in some way that his presence was being scrutinized. But rather than stopping his behavior, as a typical person might do upon realizing they were being watched, Brandon had simply become more careful. He had shifted his patterns slightly. He had begun to position himself in ways that were less obviously deliberate. He had moved certain activities to locations that were more private, less visible to Patricia's casual observation. In other words, he had adapted. Chapter 4. The Hidden Structure. What nobody in the neighborhood knew, and what would not become apparent until many months later, was that Brandon's behavior was far more extensive and far more organized than Patricia's observations had captured. Brandon was not simply watching his neighborhood out of passing interest or casual nosiness. He was engaged in systematic documentation of patterns of behavior among the people around him. In the garage of his home, hidden behind a sealed box of old paperback books that nobody else had reason to move or examine, Brandon kept a notebook. This notebook was not new. It dated back approximately 15 years. It contained detailed information about places he had lived, people he had known, and individuals he had observed. The most recent entries, dating to late 1998, were focused on his current neighborhood. The notebook contained names, addresses, detailed descriptions of routines, information about the times that specific people left their homes and the times they returned, information about who walked alone and who did not, information about which homes had security systems and which did not, information about which homes sat empty during specific hours. Brandon had created detailed entries for Patricia Hendricks. He had recorded the times she left for her book club meetings. He had noted that she gardened on Saturday afternoons, and that she never locked the back gate to her property. He had observed that she went grocery shopping on Thursday afternoons and Friday mornings with consistent regularity. He had observed that her husband, Robert, worked a schedule that often left the home empty on weekday afternoons. He had created similarly detailed entries for other neighbors. For a woman named Margaret Foster, who was divorced and had a teenage daughter, and who worked night shifts at the hospital 2 to 3 days per week, leaving her home empty for lengthy periods. For a family named Davidson, who had young children and whose youngest daughter, Emma, occasionally played unsupervised in the front yard. For an elderly woman named Dorothy Connolly, who lived alone, and who left her home unoccupied every Thursday afternoon when she volunteered at the church. Brandon's notebook read like an inventory, like a catalog of potential opportunities, like the careful planning documents of someone preparing for future action, though what specific action that might be was not entirely clear from the notebook alone. What was clear was that this was not the behavior of a normal man. This was the behavior of someone engaged in a systematic process of assessment and planning, of someone who was, in essence, hunting. Before we continue deeper into this case, I want to ask you something. Many of you watching are experiencing that peculiar sensation right now, the one where you find yourself looking around your own environment, wondering about the people who live near you, wondering about patterns you may have overlooked, wondering whether there are people in your own neighborhood who are engaged in similar behavior. This is the effect that awareness has. Once you know that such things are possible, you cannot unknow it. If you are feeling that way, that is appropriate. Trust that instinct. If something feels wrong about someone's behavior, do not dismiss that feeling. Do not assume that authorities will address it unless you bring it to their attention. For those of you who have subscribed to this channel, thank you. If you have not yet subscribed, I encourage you to do so now. We have many more cases to examine, many more stories to tell, many more mysteries that deserve your attention. If you are watching on YouTube, please hit the subscription button. Turn on notifications so that you receive updates when new content is released. Share this video with someone who shares your interest in true crime, in unsolved mysteries, in the darker aspects of human behavior. In the comments section, tell me, what would you have done if you were Patricia Hendricks? Would you have filed a report? Would you have confronted Brandon directly, or would you have done something else entirely? Your theories and perspectives matter. Now, let us return to the story, because what happens next is where the narrative begins to take on a more sinister quality. Chapter 5. The Discovery. In March of 1999, approximately 4 months after Patricia Hendricks filed her initial report, something occurred that would change the trajectory of Brandon's concealment, something that would force him to make a choice about what to do next. Susan RYNER's book club was canceled on the first Wednesday of March. 2 of the regular attendees had come down with a severe flu. The meeting, which typically ran from 7 in the evening until 9:45, was rescheduled for the following week. Susan, finding herself unexpectedly free, decided to organize the garage. She had been asking Brandon for months to help her clear out some of the accumulated items that had been collecting over the years. Brandon was in the basement. Susan decided to work on the main garage while he was occupied elsewhere. As she was moving boxes, stacking items, and organizing materials, Susan moved the large sealed box of old paperback books. She noticed, as she was moving it, that it seemed to be positioned deliberately, that there seemed to be a space behind it that appeared intentional. She moved the box further to the side. Behind it, hidden against the wall, was another box. This one was not sealed. This one was clearly part of whatever arrangement Brandon had created. Susan opened it, and what she found in that box would alter the course of her life, her understanding of her marriage, and her sense of safety forever. Inside the box were photographs. Not family photographs. Not innocent photographs. These were photographs of women and girls in neighborhoods. Photographs that appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge. Photographs taken through windows. Photographs taken in parks and streets. Some of the photographs showed faces clearly. Others showed bodies in various states of activity. Beneath the photographs were notebooks. Multiple notebooks filled with handwritten entries. Susan's hands began to shake. She sat down on the concrete floor of the garage. She read, in her husband's careful handwriting, detailed descriptions of women and girls, detailed descriptions of their homes, their schedules, their habits, notations about their vulnerability, notations about their exposure to observation. She found several pages dedicated to Patricia Hendricks. She found pages about women whose names she did not recognize. She found sketches. She found diagrams of houses and yards. When Brandon came upstairs from the basement approximately 30 minutes later, he found Susan standing in the garage. She was standing beside the boxes. Her face had the appearance of someone who had experienced a profound shock. What happened in the hours that followed is known only through Susan's later accounts to a marriage counselor, Dr. Laura Metcalf, whom Susan contacted desperately in the days that followed. According to Susan's account, the conversation was surreal. Brandon did not appear surprised or frightened or defensive in the ways that a person might typically respond if their hidden activities had been discovered. Instead, he remained calm. He approached the situation philosophically. He told Susan that she was misunderstanding what she had found, that these materials represented his private thoughts, his private observations, his private way of processing certain recurring thoughts and feelings that he experienced. He told her that he had never acted on any of these thoughts, that he had no intention of acting on them, that he was simply documenting feelings in the way that some people might write in a diary or journal. He told her that many men, more than she might realize, experienced what he experienced, that he had learned, through the course of his life, to manage these feelings through observation rather than action, that the observation was harmless, that it allowed him to satisfy certain psychological needs without harming anyone. Susan was not reassured by this explanation. She told Brandon that he needed to get help. She told him that she would not allow their children to remain in the home with this kind of activity occurring. She told him that they would need to see a marriage counselor, or she would take the children and leave. What happened next, according to Susan's account, was that Brandon agreed. He said that he was willing to seek help, that he wanted to preserve his marriage and his family, that he would see a therapist, that he would address this issue. And in the days and weeks that followed, Brandon did indeed begin to see a therapist. He stopped the outdoor observation. He destroyed many of the more recent photographs, though Susan could not be certain that he had destroyed all of them. He appeared to be, as he claimed, attempting to address his behavior. But there is a critical question that remains unanswered even today. During the months and years that followed this discovery, did Brandon truly stop his behavior? Or did he simply become more sophisticated in his concealment? Chapter 6. The Appearance of Normalcy. From May of 1999 onward, Brandon began seeing a therapist named Dr. Laura Metcalf at a private practice in Boulder. Dr. Metcalf specialized in anxiety disorders and relationship issues. Brandon presented himself to Dr. Metcalf as a man struggling with intrusive thoughts, with obsessive tendencies, and with behavior that he recognized as inappropriate. The sessions followed a relatively predictable pattern. Brandon would discuss his childhood. He would discuss his marriage. He would discuss his work. He would discuss the feelings that he experienced. He would acknowledge that his behavior had been wrong. He would express a desire to change. Dr. Metcalf's clinical notes from the period indicate that she believed Brandon was making genuine therapeutic progress. She noted that he seemed insightful, that he appeared willing to examine his behavior, that he demonstrated awareness of the impact his actions could have on his family. Over time, Dr. Metcalf increased the frequency of Brandon's sessions to twice per week, suggesting that she believed she was engaging in meaningful therapeutic work. What Dr. Metcalf did not know was that Brandon was engaged in his own form of education. He was learning how to speak about his behavior in ways that would satisfy a mental health professional. He was learning what explanations sounded reasonable, what self-insights sounded authentic, what expressions of desire to change sounded genuine. In effect, he was using therapy as a master class in deception. During the same period, Brandon's behavior in his neighborhood appeared to normalize. He was no longer observed by Patricia Hendricks standing deliberately in his yard. He was no longer observed positioning himself to watch the street. To all outward appearances, he had stopped the behavior that had initially alarmed his neighbors. But what Patricia Hendricks and others did not know was that Brandon had not stopped watching. He had simply become more careful. He had learned that being observed by neighbors created risk, so he altered his methods. He began taking evening drives. He told Susan that he was getting fresh air, that he needed time to think, that he was enjoying the peaceful Colorado landscape. During these drives, which occurred multiple times per week, Brandon would explore different neighborhoods, different towns, different areas of the greater Denver metropolitan region. He was expanding his observations. He was moving beyond Timber Ridge Road. He was creating a much larger catalog of potential targets, a much broader database of observation. The drives would often last 2 to 3 hours. Brandon would use them to observe neighborhoods, to note which houses appeared empty at certain times, to watch the patterns of women and girls in various locations, to add to his mental database of potential opportunities. What remained unclear, even in retrospect, was whether Brandon had committed any crimes during this period, whether his observation had evolved into action, whether there were victims whose disappearances had been attributed to accidents or unrelated causes, but whose fates may have actually involved Brandon. The answer to these questions would not become clear until an event occurred that would force everything hidden into sudden, terrible light. Chapter 7. The Missing Person Report. On November 23, 1999, a 17-year-old girl named Jennifer Carlisle disappeared from her neighborhood in Millbrook, Colorado. Jennifer was a senior at Millbrook High School. She was an athletic student, a member of the track and field team, healthy and social. On the morning of her disappearance, Jennifer told her parents that she was going for a run, as she did every morning before school. She left her home at approximately 6:25 in the morning. She did not return. When Jennifer was not home by late afternoon, her parents contacted the police. Officer Michael Delacroix, the same officer who had taken Patricia Hendricks' report nearly a year earlier, was assigned to investigate the missing person report. Delacroix began with the standard procedures. He interviewed Jennifer's family. He learned about her routines, her friends, her social connections. He learned that Jennifer had no known boyfriend, no behavioral problems, no reason to run away. He learned that she was a good student who was actively planning her future. She had applied to several universities. She was, by all accounts, a typically healthy, functioning teenager who had simply vanished. Delacroix organized search teams. Volunteers walked through neighborhoods calling Jennifer's name. Dogs were brought in to search for any scent trail. Local media picked up the story. A missing person, particularly a young person, was news in a town like Millbrook. As days passed without finding Jennifer, the search expanded. The investigation deepened. Delacroix began interviewing people who lived in the areas where Jennifer typically jogged. He was searching for witnesses, for anyone who might have seen anything unusual on the morning of November 23. In the course of these interviews, Delacroix spoke with Brandon RYNER. Brandon lived on Timber Ridge Road, which was not directly on Jennifer's typical jogging route, but was in proximity to areas she frequented. In the initial interview, Brandon was cooperative. He told Delacroix that he had not seen anything unusual on November 23. He said that he was home that morning and did not leave until after breakfast, when he departed for work at his usual time. Delacroix made a note of the interview, but there was nothing in Brandon's demeanor or statements that suggested immediate involvement in Jennifer's disappearance. Delacroix had learned, over his years of law enforcement, to recognize certain behavioral indicators of guilt. Brandon displayed none of them. He was calm, articulate, and his answers were consistent. But something nagged at Delacroix. He had filed Patricia Hendricks's report a year earlier. He had observed Brandon's behavior, or at least heard about it in detail. He had developed an instinct that there was something unusual about Brandon RYNER, a quality that did not quite fit the profile of a normal man. Chapter 8. The investigation deepens. As November progressed, without any discovery of Jennifer Carlisle, Officer Delacroix began a more intensive investigation of people in the areas where Jennifer jogged. He reviewed his incident reports from the previous year. He pulled up Patricia Hendricks's original report about Brandon RYNER. He made the decision to speak with Patricia again. He asked her whether she had continued to notice concerning behavior from Brandon since filing her report. Patricia stated that Brandon's obvious surveillance had seemed to stop after the spring of 1999, but that she remained concerned about him. She said that something about him simply did not feel right to her. When asked why, she could not provide a specific reason. It was intuition. It was the accumulated sense of observing someone whose behavior, while perhaps no longer explicitly threatening, remained fundamentally suspicious. Officer Delacroix began to review his own observations. In the course of his casual patrols of the neighborhood, he had noticed Brandon RYNER on a few occasions standing in his driveway or yard. While such behavior was not inherently suspicious, Delacroix's 23 years of experience told him that the context mattered. The timing, the frequency, the apparent purposefulness. He made the decision to conduct additional investigation of Brandon RYNER. He ran a background check. He found no criminal record, no arrests, no documented history of violence or criminal behavior. He spoke with Brandon's employer. The employer confirmed that Brandon was a satisfactory employee with no behavioral problems at work. Everything pointed to Brandon as a normal, unremarkable man. But Delacroix had an instinct, and that instinct, developed over more than 2 decades of law enforcement work, was telling him that something was wrong. On December 8, 1999, approximately 2 weeks after Jennifer Carlisle disappeared, Officer Delacroix made a decision that would later prove to be the turning point in the case. He parked his patrol car at a distance from the RYNER home. He waited. He observed. He watched Brandon's patterns, looking for anything that seemed out of the ordinary. At approximately 6 in the evening, as dusk was beginning to fall, Delacroix observed Brandon exit the garage carrying a large garbage bag, the kind typically used for yard waste. Brandon walked to the garbage receptacles positioned at the side of his driveway and placed the bag in one of the bins. He then returned to the garage and went back into his home. It was a mundane action, a normal household activity that occurs in millions of homes every day, but Officer Delacroix made a decision that was, at the time, legally questionable, and that today would likely be considered improper. He waited until Brandon had returned inside the home. He then parked his car, walked to the RYNER home, and examined the contents of the garbage bin. What he found, among leaves and yard waste, was a piece of jewelry, a gold bracelet, and on the clasp of the bracelet, engraved in small letters, were the initials J.C. Officer Delacroix, photographed the bracelet before carefully removing it and placing it in an evidence bag. He then left the property and contacted the detective division at the Millbrook Police Department. Chapter 9. The warrant, with the photograph of the bracelet, along with Patricia Hendricks's year-old report about Brandon's concerning behavior, along with Delacroix's documented observations, a magistrate issued a search warrant for the RYNER residence. The warrant was specific. The residence located at 814 Timber Ridge Road, including garage, basement, and all ancillary structures, all items related to observation of neighbors, including photographic equipment, notebooks, records, and surveillance devices, and any items that might be related to the disappearance of Jennifer Carlisle. On December 9, 1999, at approximately 7 in the morning, police officers arrived at the RYNER residence with the warrant in hand. Brandon RYNER was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping and suspected homicide. Susan RYNER and the 2 children were removed from the home and taken to an interview facility. What happened over the next several hours and days was a systematic cataloging of evidence that would later be described by investigators as one of the most comprehensive documentations of predatory behavior they had ever encountered. In the garage, beneath the floorboards, investigators discovered a collection of approximately 347 photographs. The photographs showed women and girls in various neighborhoods, most without any awareness that they were being photographed. Some of the photographs were taken through windows, some through gaps in fences, some from positions that suggested the photographer had been trespassing to capture the images. The photographs were organized by neighborhood, by subject, and by date. They represented years of systematic documentation. In a locked cabinet in the basement, investigators found additional notebooks. These notebooks contained detailed information about potential targets, names, addresses, photographs, schedules, behavioral patterns, and notations about vulnerability. Some entries were dated back 10 years or more. Others were recent, dating to just weeks before Jennifer Carlisle's disappearance. The notebooks contained a particular section dedicated to Jennifer Carlisle. Notations dated August and September of 1999 documented her jogging route, the time she was observed, and assessments of her isolation during these morning runs. In the garage, investigators also found the clothing that Brandon had been wearing on November 23. These items had been wrapped in plastic and concealed behind a wall panel. DNA testing would later confirm the presence of Jennifer Carlisle's blood on these garments. Following the information documented in Brandon's notebooks, investigators searched a wooded area approximately 22 kilometers from the RYNER residence. After approximately 4 hours of searching, they discovered a shallow grave. The remains recovered were those of Jennifer Carlisle. Chapter 10. The Unanswered Questions. The autopsy performed on Jennifer Carlisle's remains indicated that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head and subsequent strangulation. Time of death was estimated at November 23, the day she disappeared, with death likely occurring within a few hours of her disappearance. There were signs of sexual assault. The suffering that Jennifer Carlisle experienced in her final hours remains incomprehensible. She was 17 years old. She had been jogging near her home. She had done nothing to warrant the violence that was inflicted upon her. As the investigation continued, additional documentation emerged from Brandon's materials that suggested that Jennifer Carlisle was not his first victim, materials that raised the possibility that he had committed multiple murders across several years and several states. Investigators began contacting law enforcement agencies in Oregon, where Brandon had lived in his teenage years and early adulthood. They contacted authorities in California, where he had lived during his 20s and 30s. They asked questions about missing persons cases, unsolved murders, and disappearances that corresponded with Brandon's residence in those locations. Over the course of the next several months, a pattern began to emerge that was absolutely horrifying in its scope. In Newport, Oregon, in 1981, a young woman named Sarah Henderson had disappeared. Sarah was never found. The case remained unsolved, but investigators located a photograph in Brandon's collection that appeared to be of Sarah Henderson, taken in a parking lot without her knowledge. In Sacramento, California, in 1992, a woman named Patricia Monroe had disappeared and was found floating in the Sacramento River 3 months later. The cause of death was ruled as drowning, though the circumstances were never entirely clear. Brandon's notebooks from 1992 contained detailed information about Patricia Monroe. In Stockton, California, in 1994, a woman named Margaret Sullivan had disappeared without a trace. She was never found, but Brandon's photograph collection included images of Margaret Sullivan taken without her knowledge. In Portland, Oregon, in 1996, a teenage girl named Rebecca Chen had disappeared. Her remains were discovered approximately 6 months later in a wooded area. Rebecca had been 15 years old. Brandon's collection included multiple photographs of Rebecca taken over a period of weeks before her disappearance. In the years and months following Brandon's arrest, investigators would contact families, examine cold cases, and attempt to determine the full scope of Brandon's criminal activity. The investigation continues to the present day, and while officially Brandon has been charged with and convicted of 5 murders, there remains significant speculation and investigation into whether additional victims exist. What makes the Brandon RYNER case particularly disturbing is not merely the crimes themselves. It is the questions that remain unanswered, the questions about how much we do not know, the questions about whether all of his victims have been identified, the questions about whether his activity was truly as contained as the official record suggests, or whether there are crimes that remain unconnected, unresolved, and unknown. Chapter 11. The Layers of Concealment. What has become apparent through the examination of Brandon's materials is that he operated on multiple levels of concealment simultaneously. On one level, he appeared to be a normal, functional man. He had a job. He had a family. He participated in the basic rituals of suburban life. On another level, he maintained an elaborate structure of surveillance and documentation that was entirely hidden from public view. The photographs, the notebooks, the observations, the database of potential victims, all of this existed in concealment within his home, in spaces that nobody else had reason to examine. On a third level, there remains the question of what else exists that has not been discovered. Are there additional crimes that were never solved? Are there victims whose identities remain unknown? Are there communities that remain unaware that a predator once lived among them and targeted their residents? The detective who led the expanded investigation, a man named Raymond Pierce with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, stated in interviews that he believed Brandon was responsible for additional murders beyond the 5 for which he was convicted. Pierce noted that Brandon's materials suggested he had engaged in observation and surveillance of numerous individuals across multiple states over a period of approximately 4 decades. The probability that his criminal activity was limited to 5 murders seemed, in Pierce's assessment, statistically implausible. Yet without additional evidence, without identification of additional victims, without corroboration from reliable sources, these suspicions remain exactly that, suspicions. They remain in the realm of possibility rather than proven fact, and so the case of Brandon RYNER remains, in significant respects, unsolved. Chapter 12. The current situation. Brandon RYNER is currently incarcerated in the Colorado State Penitentiary. He is now in his early 80s. He has spent approximately 23 years in custody. According to reports from the correctional facility, he is a model prisoner. He causes no behavioral problems. He works in the prison library. He participates in religious services. He has received numerous requests for interviews from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and researchers studying criminal psychology. Brandon has declined nearly all of these requests. When asked why he declines, he has stated that there is no benefit to him in discussing his crimes further. There remain, however, significant gaps in what is known about Brandon's activities. There remain questions about specific periods in his life. There remain theories among investigators about crimes that may be connected to him, but have never been officially resolved. In 2008, for example, a woman named Helen Markley came forward. Helen's remains had been discovered in 1993 in Sacramento, California, and her death had been ruled as an accidental drowning. However, after Brandon's case became more widely known through media coverage, Helen's sister reviewed the circumstances of Helen's death and reached out to investigators to suggest that Brandon RYNER might have been responsible. The case was re-examined. While it has never been officially resolved, Helen's family came to a private conviction that Brandon was responsible for Helen's death. This pattern has repeated several times over the years. Additional families have come forward. Additional cases have been examined. But the fundamental question remains: how many victims are there? And how many crimes remain unsolved? And here we arrive at the end of what can be definitively stated about the Brandon RYNER case. But arrive at the end does not mean that we have reached resolution. Because what makes this case so deeply disturbing is not any particular crime or any specific revelation. It is the uncertainty. It is the gap between what we know and what we suspect. It is the possibility that there are victims whose fates remain unknown. It is the reality that a man engaged in systematic predatory behavior, lived in a neighborhood, worked in a community, and was part of a family, all while maintaining an elaborate structure of concealment. This case reminds us that the people around us are not always what they appear to be. That normalcy can be a mask. That concerning behavior should be taken seriously, even when it does not immediately rise to the level of criminality. That the instincts of neighbors and community members matter. That Patricia Hendricks was right to be disturbed by what she observed. That her willingness to report her concerns, even though she had no concrete evidence of a crime, ultimately contributed to the identification of a predator and the potential prevention of future crimes. If you are watching this, I encourage you to pay attention to your environment, to trust your instincts, to report concerns to appropriate authorities, to take seriously the observations of others who report feeling unsafe. The gap between suspicion and proof can be frustratingly wide, but the gap between awareness and action can be far narrower than we sometimes believe. Subscribe to this channel for more cases that remain unsolved, for more mysteries that continue to haunt investigators and communities, for more stories of people who lived in concealment, hiding terrible truths behind masks of normalcy. Turn on notifications. Share this video with others who share your interest in true crime, in unsolved mysteries, in the darkness that can exist, even in the most ordinary places. In the comments section below, tell me, what do you believe about the Brandon RYNER case? Do you think additional crimes remain undiscovered? Do you think investigators have found all of the victims? What would you have done if you were a neighbor who noticed concerning behavior? Your thoughts matter. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unsolved mystery of Brandon RYNER. We will return with more cases, more stories, more mysteries. The night has not yet ended. The fear is still real, and the truth remains, as always, just out of reach.